Well, welcome. My name is Will Roberts in Procurement Policy. If you're watching this video, you are most likely working for DoDEA as someone who is responsible for putting together something called a procurement package, working with the procurement division, and getting a service or supply. If you're wanting to know how to go about doing that or getting started with working with DoDEA procurement, then you've come to the right place. This training centers on an introduction of how to prepare your procurement package, beginning with part 1, which will talk about do you even need to come to DoDEA procurement with a PR package. Part 2 will then talk about specifically our new PR procedures and how to prepare a procurement package. There have been 2 recent changes in procurement and in DoDEA as a whole that have led us to create these trainings for preparing a PR package. The first big change is that we actually have a new PR process, a new purchase request process. The system DAI, which is what we use our time and attendance for, is now a system that we use for all budgetary and monetary matters in the agency. So not only time and attendance, but we now commit and obligate money through DAI. So the new system now is that through DAI, a PR will automatically interface with our own contract writing system. And then when we make contracts, that will automatically flow back to DAI. So because of this automatic interface process, it's led us to want to create a standard PR process to help streamline and make this process more efficient. So the second recent change in DoDEA that has also changed procurement and led for us to need to create these trainings is this RSA, this restructuring in DoDEA. The change in DoDEA's structural reorganization has shifted DoDEA personnel worldwide. Maybe in the past, the procurement staff that you've worked with have been in the same building or at least the same state or country as you're in. That may not be the case right now that after this structural reorganization. You may have to talk to people who are in different time zones. So the reorganization is also in procurement. We have a different organization. We're no longer structured geographically. We used to be DoDEA Europe procurement or DODS Europe procurement, DODS Pacific procurement. We used to have a DDES procurement office, but now we no longer have geographic divisions anymore. We're organized by functional branch. So we have the contract IT contracts branch. We have the transportation contracts branch. So these functional branches don't pay any mind to geographic. So if you have an IT requirement, you will work with the IT contract branch, which covers all IT contracts worldwide. So because of the 2 reasons above, this has really created the need for us to standardize procedures and templates in procurement. So for the first time, really, in the history of DoDEA procurement, we are creating standardized procedures and templates that will be used worldwide. So there will no longer be a Pacific way of doing things or a Europe way of doing things. We'll be using the same forms and going through the same procedures. And finally, one of the reasons why we're doing this training and offering this up is because customer service now, maybe more than ever, is a priority because of the shifting of the DoDEA personnel worldwide, because of the way we've restructured, because of our new PR process. We really need to engage and keep the communication going with the customer. So this training will then be in 2 parts. Part 1, we'll talk about just getting started. I'm going to provide a roadmap of things that you need to consider before even going into preparing a PR package. There are a lot of things that you can consider before you even know that procurement is the right choice for you. It could be that you can do a much simpler procedure without having to do a PR package. So that's what part 1 will cover. And then finally, part 2, when you finally decide that you do need to submit a PR package and you need to work with procurement, part 2 will talk about the new procedures on how to submit a complete PR or purchase request package. Okay, so let's begin with part 1, getting started, selecting the right source. So I had prepared part 2, and we were initially going to make part 2, which is just how to prepare a PR package. We were going to make that the training, and then we thought about it, and we thought it would be more beneficial if we took a step back and we created a training where we're asking the customer, do you even need to submit a PR package? There could be a lot of time wasted and a lot of money wasted by going to procurement with a PR package when you could have procured your service or supply through a much simpler process. So, before we go into part 2, which talks about preparing the PR package, we are going to first consider, do you even need to submit a PR package? And this is important. In DoDEA and as well as in every DoD agency and federal agencies, there are requirements that are procured which should have been procured through a mandatory source. So this is something that we all need to work on. And the great thing about it, which I'll explain in a future slide, is that when you comply with these policies, you're doing yourself a favor. You're saving yourself time and money. So let's begin. So before we start part 1, and I show you this roadmap that we came up with that will help you consider the steps before you reach the decision that you need to prepare a PR package. First, let's look at this example. This will maybe help you think about what we're talking about when we're talking about mandatory sources or government sources. So the example of a cell phone, you need to charge your phone. So you need to get your charger out, charge your phone. So when you see that your phone is out of batteries and you need to charge your phone, what do? Do you look in your house for a charger first? Do you check your room? Do you check where you last left a charger? Or do you immediately get up, go out of your house, go to the store, and buy a new charger? Do you do that every time you need a charger? So you continue to just get new chargers every time. So that's the mindset we need to have within the government too. Of course, you don't want to waste that kind of money by buying a new charger every time. Just use the one you have. It's the same way with government sources. The government has compiled an inventory of supplies that we need to be checking first before we go out and get that supply from a contractor. So, treat taxpayer money the same way you would treat your own. Don't be wasteful. Check the house. Check your house. So we're calling it Check Your House First. You'll see the different sources that compile this Your House, these government sources. There are also other mandatory sources that aren't in-house government sources that we'll look at as well. So the training outline for part 1, first we'll discuss this basic roadmap of the Getting Started roadmap, which we'll explain. Then we'll look at the required sources of services and supplies that you need to be looking at before you start thinking about preparing a PR package for procurement. And then finally, we're just going to discuss some dollar thresholds you need to keep in mind for your requirement. If you're brand new to working with the procurement division and getting a contract out for a service or supply you have, then there are some dollar thresholds you need to keep in mind. We'll talk about that. Okay, so we're going to start talking about this basic roadmap, things that you need to consider before you come to a realization that you do need to prepare a PR package. There are a lot of steps you need to take that could prevent you from actually needing to prepare a PR package or working with procurement. And we talked earlier about checking your house. So this is a roadmap that will enable you to check your house. So this roadmap we designed for you to print out and hang up in your cubicle or your office. If you find this helpful, you can go to our intranet site, the Procurement DoDEA intranet, and download these slides and print this out. I'm going to explain in this presentation what this roadmap is, but the intent is that you'll always have this roadmap as a guide and a source for you. So when you first have a requirement, you realize you have a requirement for a supply or a service, whether it's a bookshelf or books or school supplies or custodial services, whatever you have that you need to obtain, and you've been told by your supervisor that you need to work with procurement. The first question that you need to ask before you start preparing a PR package, which by the way is the bottom pink square on the right, before you actually get there, you need to ask the question at the very top, and that is, can this supply or service be obtained through a mandatory source? And the answer to that question could greatly affect whether or not you need to go through the trouble of preparing a PR package. Now notice the language in red that says follow the order of priorities. We'll talk about that in a minute. There's another chart for that. But let's say we can obtain our supply and our service through a mandatory source. So then you ask, what kind of mandatory source? And look at these green squares down here at the bottom left. You have a lot of these sources that you can see in these two green squares at the top. DoD, other agency inventory, wholesale supplies, if you see that there. Coordinated acquisitions in that other square. We're going to talk about all those, but just notice for now that those are green. And then those squares will then lead to a bottom green square that is called requisition. Now that is the in-house government sources. That is the cell phone charger example where you've checked the rooms of your house, you've checked your house, and you've realized that actually you have that supply already. So if the government already has that supply you're looking for, the process is much simpler. You can just transfer the money via a MIPR, which we'll talk about. You don't have to submit a PR package. You don't have to talk to procurement even. It'll be a much simpler and in most cases a much cheaper process. This is always this is why these are mandatory sources. The government is mandating that we check our house first. There are two exceptions of mandatory sources that are not in-house sources but are still required for us to check. And that is that pink square there you see that says UNICOR or AbilityOne. Now notice that that is a pink square, and by pink we're looking at things that we need to work through procurement. So the green squares here are in-house. We do it through a MIPR. It's a government source. The pink means that we need to work with procurement because that will involve creating a legally binding agreement between the government and a company or a non-government entity. And procurement is involved in that. So notice that there are two types of mandatory sources that you will still, even if they can provide it, you'll still need to go through procurement. One is UNICOR, or the Federal Prison Industries, and the other is AbilityOne. We'll talk about both of them, but I'll just say at the outset here that the reason why they're mandatory sources is not for the reasons in the green squares that they are in our house, the government already has them, don't waste money. The reason for UNICOR and AbilityOne, the reason why those are mandatory government sources is they're fulfilling some kind of social policy, providing jobs for Americans who otherwise would have a difficult time finding jobs, things like that. Federal Prison Industries provides work for our federal prisoners. AbilityOne provides work for those who are severely disabled or blind. We use AbilityOne extensively in DoDEA, and so we'll talk about both of those. Okay, so if you cannot find a mandatory source, or if you can find a mandatory source, but it is not an in-house source, it's either UNICOR or AbilityOne, you ask what the dollar value is, because it could be that you may still not have to submit a PR package. If the value is under $3,500, what we're going to talk about later as the micro purchase threshold, then you will not need to submit a PR package. You will go through the GCPC branch, Government Commercial Purchase Card branch. You can procure these supplies or services through a government commercial purchase card. We'll talk about that in detail later. There is a different threshold for services, and there are conditions to that. So, at the very bottom you see, If there are no mandatory sources, in-house sources, and you're over $3,500, that's when you come to the realization, okay, I need to work with procurement, I need to submit a PR package. And then that's what the Part 2 training will be about. There's 2 more little red squares that you see there, and that is just so that you understand that there is a difference between contracts that are over $150,000, which is also called the Simplified Acquisition Threshold, and those that are under the Simplified Acquisition Threshold, or SAT. If you hear procurement people referring to it as SAT, is it over SAT? Is it under SAT? That's what they're talking about. And different policies kick in if your requirement goes over $150,000. Then there are different reviews and different policies that we have to comply with. But if it's under, then we can do simplified acquisition procedures. So we'll talk about that later too. So this is the roadmap. We're going to show this a couple more times throughout this training. So with that roadmap in mind, let's talk about the required sources of supplies and services in more detail. Before we talk about where we can look up these mandatory sources of supplies, we're going to start with just the policy, the regulation that mandates that we check these sources first. Now remember, it's not that we are just trying to save money or we're recommending a more efficient way of procuring your supplies. This is actually a mandatory regulation, so you need to comply with this. But again, as I mentioned, this is not one of those back-breaking regulations that you need to follow. If you follow this regulation, it is to your benefit, it saves you time, and it saves you money. The Federal Acquisition Regulation, or FAR, Part 8, is called Required Sources of Supplies and Services, and FAR 8.002 says, in paragraph A, that agencies, which is you, shall satisfy requirements for supplies and services from or through the mandatory government sources and publications listed below. Now notice it says in descending order of priority. So there is an order of priority that you need to follow. So just looking down in supplies, and we're going to talk about all these different types of sources, but look at inventories of the requiring agency, for example. If you find out, let's say you're trying to order a chair, if you find out that the inventories of the requiring agency provides chairs, but also the wholesale supply sources down on number 5 also provides chairs, then because of the descending order of priority, you need to consider priority 1 first. So you need to go with the inventories of the requiring agency. So you go down the list. You check 1 first. If 1 doesn't work or they don't have it, check 2. If 2 doesn't have it, you check 3, and so on. Now notice also that supplies has a lot more sources than services. Actually, services just has 1. It's AbilityOne, which we'll talk about. And the reason why is it's common sense, if you think about it. What we're really talking about for most of these sources is the scenario in which we have a lot of extra stuff. And before we go out and get more stuff, we need to check the stuff that we already have. And that's what this policy is all about. Other than 3 and 4 there that you see for supplies, which is, as I mentioned, UNICOR and AbilityOne, which is fulfilling a social policy. But the rest are in-house sources. So let's look at number 1, inventory of the requiring agency. Now that requiring agency, that is not DoDEA. We are a Department of Defense component. So for the purposes of FAR Part 8, our agency is the Department of Defense. So what we need to do is check the inventories of the Department of Defense. We need to check and see if the DoD has what we're looking for. Now, when we're following on with this metaphor of checking your house, number 1 is checking your room. It's the room that you're in. Check your room first, okay? And the Defense Logistics Agency, DLA, is responsible for compiling all of the extra DoD stuff, putting it together, organizing it, and providing it to those DoD components who need it. We'll talk about the link for that, but it's the DLA Disposition Services, and we check there first. So keep that in mind. The requiring agency is DoD. It's not that we check the building we're in or we check the warehouse next to a school, and we're really looking at something much broader. We're looking at the Department of Defense inventory. Okay, well, let's say that the DLA, Department of Defense inventory, does not have what we're looking for. So we check the other rooms in our house, and that is the other agencies in the federal government. So the excess from other agencies, also discussed in FAR subpart 8.1, is where we check next. That is the other rooms in the house, the other agencies. That is handled by the GSA, General Services Administration. They have something called GSA Excess, and you can check there. I'll have links in a future slide. Okay, notice then the federal prison industries, or UNICOR, is number 3. Number 4 is AbilityOne. We'll talk about those two later. And then finally, number 5, there's something called Wholesale Supply Sources. GSA also has responsibility over that. In addition to DLA, we'll talk about where you can find those resources. But GSA's version is called GSA Global Supply. Okay. So GSA can be confusing. We'll talk about GSA in a minute, but when we're talking about mandatory sources that GSA provides and organizes, such as the excess from other agencies, number 2, we're not talking about GSA contracts. So in DoDEA, we use GSA contracts a lot. They're called GSA FSS, Federal Supply Schedules. You can go on GSA Advantage or eBuy and take advantage of GSA contracts. That's not at all what we're talking about here. See, GSA has their hands in a lot of different things. And what GSA also does is they organize, and they're responsible for handling the government property or inventory. So that's completely different from GSA contracts. Just keep that in mind. GSA contracts are not mandatory, but excess from other agencies is mandatory, and that happens to be organized by GSA. 8.004 in the FAR also talks about sources that are not mandatory but are recommended before considering what they call commercial sources. If you look at paragraph B down there, commercial sources, that's basically everything else. It's you going out to the marketplace, soliciting among different contractors, and getting it from a company, getting your service or supply from a company. We do that a lot in DoDEA. But what the FAR is recommending is before we go out and do that and go out to a company, we need to check and see if other agencies have existing contracts that we can just order from. It makes things a lot easier if we're able to do that. These contracts are called a lot of things. They're called federal supply schedules, government-wide acquisition contracts, multi-agency contracts. If you are familiar with DoDEA requirements, you may know that DoDEA orders from a lot of agency contracts. GSA is the main contract holder, FSS holder that we order from. We also order from NASA SOUP. These are contracts created by NASA that we order IT services and supplies from. So we take advantage of existing contracts a lot in DoDEA. But just keep that in mind, that the government is recommending that. And again, the reason why they're recommending it is for your benefit. It will make things a lot easier if we can use an existing contract to order from rather than just ordering cold into the commercial marketplace and creating a contract from scratch. In a lot of cases, we have to do that. So we use paragraph B a lot, but we don't have to get there until we find out that there's no other source available. So I mentioned before that a lot of charts and slides we have specifically designed for your benefit to be printed out. You can hang them up in your cubicle if you're involved in doing a lot of requirements with procurement and DoDEA. So this is another one. This is the priorities of sources. So in addition to your roadmap, remember that it said in that red writing that said follow your priorities. The slide will show up again, so you'll see it later as well. But the order of priorities is this chart here. So first you want to check your DoD inventories, then you check GSA, Excess, number 2, UNICOR, number 3, AbilityOne. You just go down the line. Number 6 is something we haven't talked about because it's not a FAR regulation. It's actually a DFARS regulation, Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations Supplement, DFARS, from 208.70. It's called Coordinated Acquisition. We're going to talk about that in a minute, but that is a mandatory source within the DoD only if the other 5 are not available. And of course, if no mandatory source is available, which is very common, then you will go to the commercial marketplace. But first, check and see, as we talked about earlier, if another agency has a contract that we can just quickly and easily order from. Always makes things simpler, more efficient, and usually more cost-effective. Notice again, as we discussed, services, only one source, and it's AbilityOne. We'll talk about that in a minute. So this slide is a good reference slide. It's not so good for presentation, but it's for you to have. Remember, the DoDEA Intranet Procurement Intranet site. You can download this slide presentation, download this slide, keep these sources as bookmarks because these are all of the links of the sources that we just discussed. So look at DLA disposition source, remember services, remember that's mandatory source number 1, the DoD inventory, there's the link. Other agency inventory, the link is right there, GSA Access, and down, UNICOR, AbilityOne. The wholesale supply sources links are there as well. Very easy to navigate once you go in there. You can start looking around at the supply or services you need. I'm going to talk about some of the common services and supplies that each of these sources provide, which should provide a red flag for you to look a little further if you order those types of supplies. But again, it's easy to navigate. Go in there and see and look around. Again, also, this is to your benefit. This will greatly help you if you don't have to submit a purchase request package, but instead MIPR the money over to an in-house source. Not only is it required, but it makes your life so much easier. So again, I'm redundant with my slides. We're back at the mandatory sources. This is what you check before you realize you need to submit a PR package. And now we see in blue the in-house, the check your house sources. Remember, number 1, DoD inventories, that's checking your room. And then 2, 5, and 6, that's all in-house government sources. If you can find your supply that you need in one of those 4 sources, then all you need to do is get with RM, Resource Management, and work out a MIPR, which we'll talk about, and transfer that money over for those supplies. It's a much simpler process in getting the thing that you need. So what is a MIPR? A MIPR is a military interdepartmental purchase request. It's a method for transferring funds amongst U.S. military and DoD organizations, and actually it's also a method of transferring funds amongst different federal agencies as well. So this goes beyond the Department of Defense. It allows for multi-organizational cooperative efforts to be performed. Remember, when you're checking your house for a supply and you find out that an agency has what you're looking for in additional inventory, it isn't a business transaction for you to get that supply. So when you submit a MIPR, you are transferring funds over to another agency, but the funds are being transferred for other reasons, such as the different appropriations and apportionments that were provided, the different pockets of money that each agency is provided. It's not that we are engaged in a business relationship. So transfer of funds is still needed, but it's not a contract. It's a MIPR. You use a DD Form 448 to initiate MIPRs. Because it's not a contract, procurement does not get involved. Procurement doesn't even have to know. You talk with RM, Resource Management. Talk to your favorite budget analyst, about how to begin this process of MIPRs. You can let them know, hey, I have this requirement that this source can provide, and we need to work out how to MIPR that money over to them, and they will guide you through that. Okay, note at the bottom there that if you are under the micro purchase threshold, then you may be able to use the government commercial purchase card instead of a MIPR. In a lot of cases, that may be quicker, more efficient. Contact your local GCPC contact to see if that's the best option for you. This training really does not cover GCPC procedures or methods, but know that that's an option for you. And if you see that that could work for you, talk to the GCPC branch and they'll help you out with that. So we're going to go through a couple of these mandatory sources just so I can show you some of the supplies that are available. Now, DoDEA orders a lot of commercial supplies that are pretty universal. I know that we are an education-centered DoD component. We are unique in that way. If you look at the realm of the DoD and even the federal government, we have a unique mission, but we also order a lot of universal stuff. And even the education-centered things like library bookshelves or cafeteria tables, maybe those are universal enough to be supplied by another DoD source. So we really need to start examining and seeing if we can get these things from an agency. So for global supply, for example, which is that priority 5 under supplies, look at these types of things. I went in and I just looked at the different things that the global supply provides, and the things that DoDEA regularly orders jumped out at me, and I put those on this slide. So look at copier paper, office supplies, shelving, tables, stools, chairs. We order these things all the time, and GSA Global Supply provides them. We really need to be utilizing GSA Global Supply. And I'll mention too that we do have a unique mission in a sense in DoDEA. So we don't want to try to fit a square peg in a circle hole just because shelving is offered by GSA Global Supply. If it really isn't the kind of shelving that is suitable for an elementary school library, well, then we don't need to order it just because we're thinking it's mandatory. It really needs to fit the quality and the type that we're requiring. But at the same time, we shouldn't go overboard with that. A lot of times we use restrictive language when a shelving from Global Supply would suit our needs. So we really need to improve our skills at taking the minimum requirement that we need that will still fulfill the mission and not going any more than that. That would save us money and make things way more efficient. So this is the Coordinated Acquisition Program, DFARS 208.70. This is that priority 6, which is in that chart I mentioned before. This is probably the most confusing mandatory source. There's no link for it. It's all in the DFARS 208.70 and the accompanying PGI, which is the Procedures, Guidance, and Instructions. Basically what this Coordinated Acquisition Program is that the DoD has designated certain DoD agencies with exclusive contracting authority over certain commodities. So if you look at DFARS 208.70, it'll refer you to PGI, and you'll go there, and it'll list all of the agencies that have exclusive authority and the different commodities that they have exclusive authority for. So the Army's one, you'll see the Army will be listed, and then it'll have all of the commodities that the Army has exclusive authority for. And it'll be ammunition, artillery, certain bullets, I believe. The Navy will be down there, and then their commodities will be, as you can probably guess, sea vessels, different, nautical and related commodities. So if the Army wants to buy a sea vessel that falls under that list, they have to go through the Navy. They have to get that from the Navy. That's what that means. So really, none of this applies with the type of stuff we do in DoDEA, except for the commodities that are under the exclusive responsibility of the DLA, Defense Logistics Agency. So they have a big list of commodities that only they have exclusive authority to contract. And the two that really jumped out at me when I read it was the medical equipment, which we order regularly, but not with DLA, and printing equipment, which we used to order regularly, but we have gotten better and realized that we need to go through DLA. These are copier leases, copier maintenance. We can't order that without going through DLA. They have the exclusive authority. And may I also mention that they have exclusive authority over medical equipment. So if you are involved in ordering medical equipment, you need to look into DLA. Okay, and note also that this coordinated acquisition program, this is only something you need to consider if none of the other mandatory sources apply. So this is the lowest priority. Check all the other sources first. Okay, so we looked at the in-house sources, the blue, where you check your money, and just keep in mind that that's money that you can do through a MIPR. You can transfer that without working through procurement. You can get your goods in a more efficient and streamlined way, saving you money and time. All the other sources, the sources in red here, they are sources that are not in-house. That means that in order to get these services, we have to enter a legally binding contractual agreement with a company, a non-government entity, for the exchange of services or supplies for money. And that is where the procurement division will get involved. However, you do not have to submit a PR package if, as we mentioned before, your requirement is under $3,500, which is the micro purchase threshold. So let's look at this roadmap again. We've already talked about the green squares. That's the in-house government sources. Now we're moving over to the pink squares. As we mentioned before, this is where we are now going to enter a contractual agreement with a company not in our house, a company outside our house. So we are working with the procurement division now because the procurement division deals exclusively with arrangements with companies, not government sources. So first we ask what the dollar value is. And before we do that, I'd like to talk about UNICOR and AbilityOne, these two sources that are mandatory but are not in-house. So UNICOR, also called Federal Prison Industry Incorporated, or FPI, these are supplies that are furnished and provided by a company that provides this work to federal prisoners. So, one really important thing to keep in mind, actually there's two important things to keep in mind. The first is that, as with the others, this is only required for you if the item is really comparable to the private market item in terms of price, quality, and delivery times. Okay, so let's look down and let's look at the lockers, for example. See the examples of common UNICOR supplies. One of those is lockers. So let's say you're in charge of purchasing lockers for a locker room in the gym. You have to make sure that if UNICOR does provide those type of lockers, you don't have to get them from UNICOR if they don't specifically fit in that environment of let's say a boys' locker room in the gym with the right size, the right quality, the right delivery times, and, very important, the right price, a reasonable price. If it doesn't check those boxes, then you don't need to use UNICOR. Another big exception is that UNICOR does not apply for supplies acquired and used outside the United States. So in Europe and the Pacific, UNICOR will not apply to you. But that being said, look at these UNICOR supplies. Awards and plaques, electrical equipment, office furniture, shelving, cafeteria furniture, lockers. You know, these should be red flags for you if you are involved in ordering these types of things. If you are working as an IT customer, electrical equipment's very vague. It most likely doesn't have anything to do with anything that touches the enterprise. Probably hardware type things like wiring. But it should be a red flag for you to do some research and see what they do provide. cafeteria furniture. It may be mess hall furniture for active duty soldiers. We may not be talking about furniture for children in an elementary school, but it's a red flag for you to research more. All of these are starting points, because remember, if they can provide it for you, it makes your life easier. The second company that is a mandatory source, that is not government but still mandatory, is AbilityOne. Now, AbilityOne provides work for people who are severely disabled or blind. If you're familiar with our Skillcraft supplies, our pens, pencils, that's all AbilityOne supplies. I think they were put together by those who are blind, or at any rate, those who are severely disabled. They publish something called a procurement list, and it's very easy to look this up. You can look at the link on the slide before. They have a procurement list for supplies and a procurement list for services. If your supply that you're looking for is part of that procurement list, it means AbilityOne can provide it, and it's mandatory, and that you need to use it unless, of course, those other higher priority sources can provide it as well. The procurement list for services is a little more complicated. You need to make sure that AbilityOne really provides those services for DoDEA specifically, and specifically for your location. So I'll give you an example. Custodial services is a common service that's in AbilityOne procurement list. And indeed, we actually use AbilityOne for a lot of our custodial contracts. But if we don't have to use AbilityOne, then we don't want to necessarily enter a contract with AbilityOne. Because although the policy is great and how they provide work for those who need the work is great, the contracts are very expensive and they're very hard to negotiate. And the policy is fulfilled only if it's required. So we need to look at that list. And if it says custodial services and the location is Fort Bragg, we need to look at the component it's required for too. Because if it just says Army, we are not required to use AbilityOne. If it says custodial services for Fort Bragg for all DoD agencies, that means that AbilityOne is the required source for all custodial services in Fort Bragg, regardless of what agency orders it. So that would mean that it's part of that list. So just pay attention to the procurement list for services. Make sure you're reading it properly. You can always ask procurement with help with that, but we don't want to be signing contracts with AbilityOne when we don't have to. The types of common services that we have contracts with in DoDEA: custodial services, groundskeeping, document destruction, also closing out contracts. Medical equipment, office supplies, and computer equipment are common supplies that are on the supply procurement list of AbilityOne. So again, the link is in that previous slide. Become familiar with AbilityOne and looking at those lists in addition to the other sources. So there's a couple other miscellaneous required supplies or sources that you need to know about, especially if you are involved in procuring supplies or services related to one of these three areas. Printing and related supplies. We've already talked about how the DLA has exclusive authority over that. As far as subpart 8.8 talks about the DLA's exclusive authority as well. I think this is mainly dealing with publication, but check that out if you are involved in requirements that deal with that. Leased motor vehicles. We do this a lot in DoDEA. And we need to make sure that we're doing it the right way. So if you have that as your requirement, just contact the appropriate logistics transportation specialist who will be familiar with the different procurement rules about leased motor vehicles. Finally, food services. Look at DLA, troop support, substances, food services, and talk to DLA to see if they're a required source. We do have culinary arts programs. We have arts competitions in our schools. This may or may not fit what DLA provides here, but again, it's a red flag. And so if you are involved in a culinary arts program and you see this here at the bottom, this should be a red flag for you. do some research, contact DLA, see if they can provide the type of stuff that you order. And if they can, again, it makes things simpler for you. Okay, so we're moving past mandatory sources now. Now we're in the part of the roadmap, which we'll show in just a minute, where we haven't found a mandatory source. Now we're thinking about going through procurement. We're thinking about creating a contract, going out to a company. I'm going to mention very briefly in this slide and this slide only that there are small business rules that you will need to follow and become accustomed with the more that you work with requirements through procurement. The Small Business Administration, which was formed in compliance with the Small Business Act, was created for the purposes of promoting small businesses in America. I'd like to make this note too, for those who are in the Pacific or Europe, we're talking about American small businesses, so we can't fulfill small business quotas with all due respect to other companies and other countries. The SBA does not care about German small businesses or Japanese small businesses. We're trying to promote American small businesses. So requirements between the micro purchase threshold, which right now is $3,500, and SAT, Simplified Acquisition Threshold, which is $150,000, that is automatically reserved exclusively for small business. We can only go through small business with that value, $3,500 to $150K. And that is a majority of our contracts that we have in DoDEA. And we can only go to the commercial full and open competition to large businesses as well if we prove, and by we I mean the contracting officer or KO, proves and determines that there are not at least 2 responsible small businesses who can provide this service for us in the type of price, quality, and delivery that the market provides. We really have to prove this. So small business is a big deal. We need to engage in small businesses. And so keep that in mind. Your procurement personnel that you will be working with will have this in mind too. And the first thing they will be thinking of is, how can we go about getting this from small business? And if you want a large business, why? Are there no small businesses that can do this? Prove it. We'll have to document that. So contact the DoDEA Small Business Specialist for more information. And then we're going to have a separate market research training that will also assist you into researching small businesses. So again, this is the same priority of sources slide. We've talked about 1 through 6. We've talked about, for services, AbilityOne, which is the only mandatory source. Checking that procurement list for services under AbilityOne. That's all you'll need to do to check your mandatory source if your requirement is a service. Okay? We talked a little bit about checking the non-mandatory sources. Remember, other agencies' contracts, and then commercial sources at the very end, only when we've checked everything first. And again, here is our roadmap. We've talked about everything here. We've talked about the in-house government sources in green, which is a great scenario because all you need to do is MIPR the money over. We've talked about the squares in pink, which does involve the procurement division. However, if it's under $3,500, you will not need to submit a purchase request package. Let's talk about these red squares. We've already mentioned this. These thresholds of $3,500 and $150,000. The $3,500 is the micro purchase threshold. The $150,000, as we mentioned, is the SAT, which means Simplified Acquisition Threshold. So dollar thresholds are very important in procurement language and the way we think about how we're going to plan a procurement. Everything really hinges on what the dollar amount is. What's the estimated value of your requirement? And by the way, how you find out what that estimated value is not by asking procurement, It's not by looking necessarily online to see what that is. It's through you. You are the one who comes up with the Independent Government Cost Estimate, which is the IGCE. You do it through a variety of different means. As we'll discuss later, we're going to have a training on that. The cost estimate will be a mandatory part of your PR package. It's a very important document that lets everyone know what the estimated value is. And the estimated value will determine whether it fits a certain threshold. So let's look at the thresholds. The first threshold to remember, to keep in mind, is the micro purchase threshold, which we've discussed. Right now, it's at $3,500. It changes every now and then. If you are under $3,500, you can procure your supply through a GPC or a GCPC, Government Purchase Card. However, keep in mind that if you are trying to procure services, you cannot use the GCPC unless it's under $2,500, and that has to do with thresholds in the Service Contract Act. Again, for questions about this, please contact the GCPC branch. So if you're over $3,500, you are working on a procurement package. Okay? Additional consideration to keep in mind, you will need to submit a PR package no matter what if you're over the micro purchase threshold. However, your procurement can be much simpler if it's $150,000 or under. Services and supplies may be procured using what's called simplified acquisition procedures. If you're over the simplified acquisition procedures, it's not a big deal, but of course there's different levels of review and different rules that kick in, and you just need to be mindful of this as you work with procurement and getting what you need. Keep in mind that as that note says at the bottom, that there are situations in which we still can use simplified procedures if the supplies or services go up to an amount up to $7 million. However, it really depends on the complexity and nature of the requirement that you have, which will determine how much time needs to be spent making sure that we get the right service or supply in proportion to the requirement that you need. So this is the only slide that will cover the GCPC. And the main reason is that there is a completely different branch within procurement for GCPC. They have trainings, they have guidance. Contact them with any GCPC related training. But it is the preferred method for paying for goods and services under the micro purchase threshold. Keep in mind the $2,500 threshold for services. Also keep in mind that overseas there could be a $25,000 limit under certain conditions. So talk to the GCPC branch about questions about whether or not you can use a government commercial purchase card for your requirement. Finally, some things to keep in mind if you are over the micro purchase threshold, you're at that final stage where you realize you need to submit a PR package. So you are now in a situation where you will be working with procurement on your requirement. You need to be mindful of things called acquisition lead times, which the contract specialist will have to a certain amount of time to complete your requirement. Be mindful of the fact that there are small business rules and goals. There are competition rules and goals. You can't just go out and buy the type of book or shelf that you like based on the brand name. We have to make sure that there is fair competition at all times. Unless there is truly only one source, and in that situation, we must justify it thoroughly and effectively. There are rules relating to contract performance review requirements, CPARs, that you may have to be involved in if you are a core contracting officer's representative. Just be mindful of that. We do cradle to grave contracting, which means that after the contract is created, You may have to still be involved in what we call post-award administration of the contract, where you're measuring the contractor's performance. Just keep that in mind. There are contract review requirements that if it is a certain amount, a certain estimated value, it means that there are different levels of contract review before it's even awarded. Policy, legal, the head of the procurement branch at times. So you need to start preparing for all these things as you start planning your requirement, and know that some things take time. And for that reason, please submit your PR package before the annual cutoff date. When you do this, it's to your advantage. When you don't give procurement enough time to really plan the requirement with you, and they get backed into a corner, what that really does, it increases costs and increases the risk of protests. And for you, it really increased the risk that you will not get the requirement that you want. So finally, to close out part 1, here's the roadmap again. Remember, going through this process before you decide that you need to submit a PR package is very beneficial to you. Now note that bottom square on the right, that pink square that says over 3,500, that is where you get when you decide you need to submit a PR package. Look at all of the squares above that pink square. Those are all of the situations in which, especially those green squares and the 3,500 GCPC, those are situations in which you do not need to submit a PR package, where your life will be easier. So think about those things before you come to procurement with a PR package.